Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion. I'm so grateful to have everyone here this evening. I'm Monica Garza. I'm the Charlotte Wagner Director of Education here at the ICA. And our program this evening has been organized to give our speakers a chance to reflect on their experiences while giving us an opportunity to hear about the making of two installations featuring the artwork of Simone Leigh. Now, before welcoming our speakers, I want to be sure to thank a few individuals and organizations that are not on this stage, but nevertheless have also played a pivotal role in this work. Thank you to the generosity of so many who believed in this work from the start. Working on two continents is not an easy task, as you'll hear later today. But that said, we are very grateful for the partnership and trust in our work from these organizations. Likewise, I want to extend our deepest thanks to ICA staff. These exhibitions require the contributions and collaborations from every single department of this museum. We have an extraordinary community who works creatively and passionately every day here at the ICA, and we're really grateful for everything that they do. Now, part of this community are our three speakers tonight who really need no introduction, so I'm going to keep it pretty brief. Jill Medvedow is the Ellen Matilda Poss Director and has been leading the ICA for 25 years. Under her leadership, the ICA opened its doors on Boston's waterfront, transformed a condemned former copper pipe factory into a free open space for art in East Boston, and has been a champion of our work in the education department, especially with our work with teen students. Jill is co-commissioner of the 2022 U.S. Pavilion and will help moderate tonight's conversation. Ava Respini is co-commissioner and curator of the 2022 U.S. Pavilion. She is also the deputy director for curatorial affairs and Barbara Lee, chief curator here at the ICA. At this museum, she has organized several major exhibitions, including those featuring artists such as Fairleigh Baez, Dina Lawson, Jonna Comfra, and William Forsythe. Anni Pullagura is curatorial assistant at the ICA, where she supports the organization of Simone's presentation at the 2022 U.S. Pavilion and also here in Boston. Other presentations that Anni has curated at the ICA include the work of Jordan Nasser and this fall's 2022 James and Audrey Foster Prize exhibition. Now, without further ado, please help me welcome our three guests.
Thank you, Monica. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on our stage with you. And it's so nice to be with you, Ava and Anni, to kind of recap what we've hardly had time to lift our heads and think about. So I'm going to jump right in because it's been a 3-year project to bring this exhibition. I hope you've all seen it, or if not, immediately following our galleries are open. But it's been a 3-year project and done mostly during the pandemic. So unusual in that way, too. But this project began, actually, Ava, with your invitation to Simone to come and visit our watershed with an eye to commissioning her to do a project there. That did not happen. So can you walk us through kind of from there to here, and also what was it like from your perspective? I know we did this together, but working, across the ocean in a very old city where everything moves by boat during a pandemic.
Yeah. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. But yes, the story of this project, which has so many tentacles, started 3.5 years ago with the invitation for Simone to come up and visit our watershed. We had a lovely visit. We took the boat across the harbor. She, really enjoyed her time in Boston. But as we started talking, she said, I'm not really interested in a commission. And she and I started talking, and it really became evident that what was needed was a survey exhibition. And what you're looking at on the screen now speaks to the time in which I was, inviting her up here and speaking to her. It was a time where Simone had a lot of visibility in New York. There were sort of 3 presentations of her work within a 1-year or 18-year period in New York. One was the Hugo Boss Prize at the Guggenheim. very visible solo exhibition. Her commission of at the High Line of Brick House, which was, incredibly well received and, very prominent. And then she was also included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial. And what was happening is this incredible visibility and, great response to the work. But a lot of people in New York, especially who were seeing the work, were talking about Simone as if she were an emerging artist, as if it was just the last 5 years that she'd been working, when in fact, she's been working and has been working steadily with her head down for 20 years, close to 25 years. And so in speaking with her after she very politely declined the opportunity of the watershed, it sort of dawned on me, and in conversation with her, what she needs is a proper survey where we really look at the work in depth and make the argument that this is an artist at the height of her powers, and this is an artist who's been working so consistently with themes and material concerns over 20, 25 years. And it's high time to do not only a show of this scale, but also a book. Because the other thing that was equally sort of surprising is to learn that she has no monograph. And so the invitation then became, a major show here at the museum with a monograph that would really be an opportunity to commission scholarship. So then we started working on that show, and there was a moment when I think both you and I, Jill, had a very similar thought. I actually remember when we were in your office in a meeting together, where I had this crazy idea. I thought, Simone's work really needs to be shown on a larger stage than the ICA is a great stage, it's large, but it needs to be global, it needs to be international. And I think I said, very tentatively, not sure what my boss would say about this, what if we put our name in the hat or the ring and go for Venice? And, if I recall, you were like right there, same sort of idea. And so we decided to do that. And I remember saying to Simone at the time, is this something you want to do with us? Because the way that it does happen is that an institution does need to apply to become the commissioner for the US Pavilion as an artist or as a curator. You can't do it. It has to be an American nonprofit organization, arts organization. And Simone said, yeah, let's try it. Why not? Let's give it a go. And I said, yeah, it's a long shot. We'll never get it. So we submitted our application, when was that? February
2020.
Of 2020, thinking that, we were applying for the 21 biennial. Lo and behold, we did get the commission. Simone was awarded the commission to represent the United States, the first Black woman to do so. And when we got the news, the pandemic, we were in lockdown. And so then we flipped the script. We said, okay, Venice first, and then this exhibition here will be a homecoming of Venice. And so the exhibition did change a little bit. It's still, for those of you who've seen it upstairs or haven't yet, it's the nucleus of the show are the works that she made for Venice, but they're joined by works from throughout the 20 plus year career to give a context, because I still maintain and still believe that, this moment when everyone is sort of in New York that I was talking about, where people, were talking about Simone as if she was an emerging artist, I still think that's true, that there hasn't been enough exposure of really looking at the career with a little bit more of a context. And that's how we landed on what is upstairs in our galleries. And then the other thing I will say about working on the Venice Biennial and then bringing it here, and I think, Annie and I, as we've been working together on the show, we've talked a lot about this, is we're not presuming people have been to Venice or seen Venice or even know what the Venice Biennial is in working with the show here. That while they're interrelated, the project in Venice and here, they are two separate things. And it's been a real pleasure to install the work twice. They look very different in each place, and they start to take on different meanings. And to join the Venice works with works from earlier in the career, you can really see this consistency, this thread of an artistic language that is so uniquely hers. And that's, I think, what the show here can do that's different than what we did in Venice, which was much more a singular artistic statement.
How many people have actually seen the exhibition already? Can't quite see. So most, right. Yeah. So you see that we tried the works from Venice have been, in many cases, expanded, or works of art that were brought to Venice but didn't ultimately make it into the US Pavilion have found their place in this exhibition. But it feels very different in a contemporary, relatively new space than it did in the 1930 US Pavilion. Very, very different.
But maybe I can ask you, Jill, from your perspective as a co-commissioner, how do you become a co-commissioner? What was that process? Can you talk us through it? And also, what's the importance for you and kind of for our art world of the Venice Biennial?
Right. A lot of people have asked, how do you get this? How do you get it? How do you apply? And as Ava said, any nonprofit organization can apply to the U.S. State Department's Department of Education and Cultural Affairs. They issue a call. In fact, the call is out right now, and proposals are due very soon. I don't know the date. I don't have to know the date this round. But I'd say in the next few weeks, and it goes through a panel of peers, and then it goes through a few different stages of approval by the State Department and ultimately selected. Actually, I think part of our proposal, when we submitted it, as Ava said, none of us thought we were going to get the award, but I felt fairly confident that we would be one of like the top, 2 or 3 contenders. It was a very, very strong proposal because of the strength of Simone as an artist, her initial ideas of what she was going to do in this space, and a partnership with Spelman College that was part of our proposal, because the proposal, in addition to the art and artist, has an educational component. So each institution applying for it also has to have crafted those partnerships or those activities as well. At any rate, so it goes through a process. We thought then, and I think very much now that finally it's here, was that it seemed critical, given the importance of the exhibition, overdue survey exhibition or major museum exhibition for Simone, overdue monograph publication, that this not live just globally, not in Venice, since most people are not going to the Venice Biennale, right? Many people go, but not most people, though we did break all records in the history of the pavilion for attendance, with 650,000 people visiting the US Pavilion. But it seemed critically important to bring that work back to Boston so that we could share it with our community, because this is our home. That's not our home. Exciting as it is to do that, this is where we live. And so we spent about a year, the two of us, in a series of conversations. Again, it was pandemic, so they were on Zoom with a wide range of members of different communities: education, cultural, elected officials, colleagues, artists, trying to introduce the Venice Biennale and the art of Simone Leigh, so that we could both solicit ideas about the exhibition and work that we could do in our community when it arrived, and also to begin to just introduce it so we could build up some excitement and knowledge in advance. And at the same time, we wanted very much to have a national tour, so that when the work leaves Boston, it's going to the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., and then it's going to Los Angeles to the LA County Museum of Art and the California African American Museum there. So for me, part of the importance is to take all of this love and labor that we have put into it, and you saw the list of donors, over 60 sponsors of this exhibition to realize this and make it happen, that it would really have a life locally, nationally, and globally, and to make sure that the art of this, Simone Leigh has an incredibly unique, distinct visual language, and she knows to whom she is addressing her art, primarily Black women. You see the power of it for Black women in our galleries, but also more broadly than that. It is about an ethos of collaboration and community as well that has been exemplified. We'll talk about that. And to share that as widely and with as open arms as we possibly could.
And maybe just because I'm looking at the slide, I just might add about the significance of the Venice Biennale. It's one of the oldest, longest running biennials of contemporary art. And Annie and I have connected on this because we both come from families that are not well versed in art. So the way I explained it to my parents when I told them that we were embarking on this is that it was the Olympics of the art world. That it was, you know, the kind of biggest, most visible platform, this notion of representing your country, which is, you know, a pretty, I think a pretty heavy mantle for any artist to take on, and something that's quite complex and was something Simone really wrestled with. But just to say that, you know, that importance and that historical importance of Venice, I think, was something we thought and talked a lot about with Simone and as a curatorial team.
And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about how Simone transformed the exterior of the U.S. Pavilion. One of the things that I see and that is so clear in the exhibition is that Simone's hand is visible in almost every single work of art. So it isn't work that is sent out to fabricators from beginning to end with a drawing, right? She's a ceramicist, first and foremost, and I mean, at the top of her game in her abilities. But I wonder if you could talk about actually how the works are made.
Sure, yeah, and these are two good images to start, and Annie, please do jump in because, you know, even though it was the pandemic when this work was being made, we had a lot of Zooms, or we got a good insight onto how Simone was making the work, and I was able to travel to the Foundry to see some of these in person. So a number of the works that Simone made for the U.S. Pavilion, which are in view upstairs, are in bronze. And the way that the bronze casting process works is that the models are made in clay, in modeling clay, prior to being cast in bronze. And modeling clay is a little bit different than the kind of clay you would use for ceramics. It's less pliable, it's a little bit more sturdy. But because Simone is an artist that has always worked in clay and really has an amazing facility with clay, she built all of her models for the bronzes to scale, at 100% scale, which is pretty unusual. If you're making bronze at a monumental scale, an artist might, you know, make it like this, and then the foundry sizes it up. And so you can see here with the picture with the very large elongated figure, which is titled Sentinel, you can see that is Simone at the bottom there sculpting the legs of that figure. And you can see, you know, if Simone were to stand up, she'd probably come mid-thigh. So just imagine the monumentality, the effort, the labor, the love that goes into her sculpting that at 100% scale. And for me, the resonance of the works, you can see the hand. You can see and feel the hand when you're standing in front of the completed bronze work. And her hand has touched everything upstairs. Yes, she does have a studio. She does have studio assistants, but they are really there to help support, you know, her final hand and her final making. And it really was a kind of privilege and pleasure to see her making the works and to see her being so hands-on in the making of the work from, you know, as soon as we got the commission till basically the works shipped. It was all day, every day.
Annie, I think the next slide, I was wondering if you could jump in, because another one of her signature materials is raffia. And could you tell us a little bit about what we are looking at here?
Yes, so one of the ways that Simone has intervened in this history of the U.S. Pavilion, the history of the Venice Biennale, is an aspect to her practice that I think she's consistently done throughout her work, is really in investigating these historical relationships. And so here what she's been really thinking about is the way that World's Fairs, pavilions, these other expositions of art have often employed the colonial languages. So what we're looking at here are these references to the Paris exposition that was a an exposition that Simone has been thinking about for a long time. She began thinking about this almost 20 years before the commission of Venice. So it's been in her kind of visual language for a while and has always wanted to kind of articulate, a way to think about this through her creative artistic practice. So one of the first ways that I think she approached the U.S. Pavilion was really thinking of it as a sculpture, to really transform the pavilion into a work of sculpture. And what she's done here is create this thatched roofing that sits right adjacent to the facade of the U.S. Pavilion. And what I love about that adjacency is that there's actually, if you walk right underneath it, I always point out to visitors, is that there's actually a gap between the facade, the thatched raffia, which is a type of palm tree that's native to Madagascar and many places in the global south, and has a lot of connotations with architecture and use-valued objects. But she's built this thatched roofing that is just almost touching the facade, but leaves a gap. And I think that's such a great metaphor with how Simone thinks about the creative act. There's a concept that she has really explored quite often that was coined by Saidiya Hartman, a longtime collaborative of hers, who has come up with a term called critical fabulation, which is a strategy that Saidiya has thought about, that artists and scholars have used to intervene into the absences or gaps in the historical record, and to do that in a creative way. And Simone has been doing this, throughout her practice, but often, told Eva and I at one point that when she discovered Saidiya had come up with this term, she's like, oh yes, that's what I've been doing all along. I finally have the words for it. And I think we see that really strongly in this particular work, which is the first thing you see when you encounter the U.S. Pavilion, is this complete transformation that really brings these colonial histories of empire, histories of nationalism into this conversation that is underscored by her own creative take, this way of intervening in that historical gap.
That's fantastic. I mean, for those who don't know, in the World's Fair that Annie's referring to occurred in 1931 outside Paris, and it was a World's Fair celebrating colonialism. There was a full-scale replica of Angkor Wat. There were African villages where people were brought in to inhabit those villages and live there. And so that is the history that Simone is referencing and changing, transforming, as well as the architectural references to African architecture. So again, she collapses time, geography, materials to create something altogether new. But it's also interesting that when the Venice Biennale was founded in 1895, it was a time of changing kind of very forceful colonialism, but it was when the modern Olympics began, it's when the Nobel Prizes began, and it's when this idea of this global art exhibition began. So these notions of nationhood and colonialism began to really get propagated at a much larger scale.
And it just might be worth mentioning for those of you who have not had the chance to visit the Venice Biennale where these national pavilions sit. It's an outdoor park, and each national pavilion, which are rather small, they're permanent buildings, but they're pretty small, and they embody the kind of national ideals of that given country through its architecture. So the US Pavilion is actually reminiscent of Monticello. The Scandinavian Pavilion looks like a modern Scandinavian, architecture, piece of architecture. So as you walk around, it's very much a World's Fair model. And so these kind of joining of these two histories is particularly poignant in what Simone did.
I'm not sure. The next slide?
Yes.
Right. So this idea of historical references, so in the same way that facade referred to a very specific World's Fair, several of the artworks upstairs also have specific historical references. So Eva, can you jump in and tell us about this amazing work of art?
Sure. This piece is titled Last Garment, and it's very dramatically situated in our galleries in a beautiful pool, a body of water adjacent and looking onto the Boston Harbor, and what I think is a very breathtaking presentation. And the title of this piece, Last Garment, is taken from the sort of starting point of Simone's research, which is a photograph that was made in the early 20th century, which I think is on the next slide, titled Mammy's Last Garment. This was taken in Jamaica by an American photographer. And this is an image that was used on posters and postcards and was circulated as a kind of archetype, a trope, a stereotype. This anonymous laundress, this washerwoman, and it was used for the purposes of trying to attract tourists to Jamaica, at the time the British West Indies. And this kind of stereotype and trope was quite popular. He was among several who were sort of making this kind of image. And Simone was really starting her research and thinking about, you know, the anonymous labor of this woman, thinking about the anonymity of the woman herself. Likely this photograph, I think we could say, was taken probably without her consent, maybe even without her knowledge. And Simone then really thought about bringing this photograph into 3 dimensions, and the resulting sculpture is one that on one hand is faithful to the photograph in the posture of the figure, in its, you know, its faithfulness to her being in a body of water, but also departs from it, that this isn't just a recreation or a didactic recreation of the photograph, but rather is an interpretation that Simone has taken and then made her own. So for example, some of the elements or motifs that we see again and again in Simone's work, for example, the very finely crafted rosettes that are that make up the hair of this figure are present in many of the other works in the exhibition and her works at large. And also, you can't see from this slide, but you'll see that the face of this figure has no eyes, which again is a motif that you see again and again in Simone's work that really does kind of evoke a sense of, is she looking at herself? Is there an inner world that we can't access? So even in the act of monumentalizing, memorializing this anonymous labor in bronze, which is the most, you know, enduring material of all. If you think about how do we write histories, we erect bronze statues in our town squares, right? And so Simone has used that same material to memorialize and to think about the anonymous labor or this anonymous washerwoman within the context of her show.
I think we have a couple of slides because this idea of the anonymity of the women, I mean, it's interesting because the women, there's a implicit criticism, of course, of taking advantage of the image of women's labor. But in Simone's sculpture as well, she has, there is an impenetrability in creating all of these faces without specific eyes and without being a specific portrait. Annie, thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I think this is an aspect or a motif that Simone has used throughout her figurative works that I think many people have commented on, and I think that comment takes shape in many different interpretations. You know, some people have ideas of it being a sense of refusing the gaze, of not wanting to be received, and how that might map onto a sense of the fact that these are images of Black women and what it means to refuse to be a subject to a gaze, and instead to take one's own gaze into as a sense of an empowerment. And I think all those interpretations are very interesting. I feel, you know, Ava and I have talked a lot about what Simone might have to say about some of these kinds of readings. And I think ultimately for Simone, I think this is a strategy of abstraction. You know, even though she's making figurative works, they're not portraits. They are infused as much as lifelike as they are. They're infused with abstraction. There's ways of reading the body that give it a very interesting reading that really sets it apart into the realm of abstracted sculpture. And I think this is one of the strategies for it. There's actually a really interesting reading from Christina Sharp where she talks about the eyeless face, the idea that they're without eyes, but they all have eyes, as in capital I, the pronoun. They all have a presence. And I really love that reading as well, because when you're in front of these works and the power they exude and the space they take up, I think is a really fantastic way of thinking about these sculptures as really owning themselves, maybe reflecting on themselves, seeing themselves in ways that maybe we don't have access to, but they certainly have access to themselves.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, like all of those readings are really fruitful and rich. I do think Simone, maybe because a lot of people have written about this aspect of her work, that Simone really has insisted that for her it's about abstraction. And we see that abstraction also in the body, for example, in the bronze piece that is gold-leaved. That piece, she talks a lot about the torso when she was making it. She was looking at cycladic sculpture, and that abstracted torso is a reference to that. So for her, I think it's also, it's very much mired in formal discussion.
Before we turn to the book and some of the works in the show, I wanted to ask you, Ava, you've organized many solo artist retrospective survey shows. And it's always pretty interesting how artists respond to this backwards look, you know, of their work. What's been your experience here?
Well, I think it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard to feel like you're being historicized when you're still here, when you're working, when you're, you know, at the height of your powers. I think it's a very difficult thing for an artist to sort of contend with that. I think, you know, for Simone, this being the first more comprehensive exhibition, she really wanted to resist the notion of chronology. She was very clear about that. And, you know, that kind of goes against, I think, a little bit more of our curatorial art historical training, where I think we, you know, we like to tell the story of, well, in the beginning it was this, and then it went to that, and it went to that. And Simone was very clear that she was much more interested in a discussion and in a presentation where the works across time spoke to one another. And for example, the slide that you're looking at now, these are two works, two busts that are, you know, maybe 15 years apart in terms of the date in which they were made, but they appear in the same room, the second room in the exhibition upstairs. And the first one, the one on my right, is the first figurative sculpture that Simone made. And you can see all of the elements, and the one with the yellow glaze is from 2023, or very recent. So you can see all of the elements are there, and what I love is that you can see how things have changed, you can see how the methodology has changed, but yet you can also see that consistency. But I would say Simone always kind of resisted the didacticism. You know, she was much more interested in how things speak to one another rather than, you know, an art historical lecture about it. And for me, you know, as a curator, that's a great lesson. And working with living artists, yes, it is about seeing how the career is continually evolving and changing. And even though we like to maybe think in more fixed terms as curators, it was really interesting to see how she was constantly thinking about these works as they weren't finished and out in the world, they were still living and breathing and changing.
Do you think, though, that the historicization is really kind of both racially and gender biased, in that there's plenty of historical exhibitions and surveys, and historicization of men, white men, and so it's kind of an uneven historicization.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Hold on. Okay, got it back. Annie, you had a key role in the book. The book is how thick? Just show us to begin with.
I want to say like 2 inches, 2.5 inches thick.
Right, it's forthcoming. So big, it's taken us a little longer. But can you give us a sense of who some of the writers are, or who are the writers on the screen, and what was new? What was new for you after all the time you've spent in reading kind of the contributions of this amazing group of women?
Yes, the working on this exhibition catalog was so rewarding, and I'm so excited for it to be in the hands of so many people later this year. I think, you know, exhibition catalogs do important work. You know, they're the records of the exhibition. They tell an important story that lasts much longer than once the installation is over. But, you know, just as Ava was talking about this, you know, experience of developing the Simone Leigh exhibition in partnership with the Venice experience and bringing the works back here to Boston, I think our thinking on the catalog also shifted and changed. You know, this was a moment that we quickly realized was a chance to really offer Simone her first serious monograph, a chance to really think and put into print the ideas and histories and collaborations that she has sustained for the past 20, 25 years. And I think that's really reflected in the list of contributors. And just to underscore that, I'm going to read every name because I just really want to make an emphasis about how much this catalog, once it is, in print and in the world, is going to make such a huge contribution to not just the career of this artist, but to fields of contemporary art, fields of Black feminism and theory, and these important conversations that will be continuing even after the publication. So we have a list of contributors, over 20, that range from art historians to artists to poets to anthropologists and other close collaborators of Simone. From Vanessa Agar-Jones, Rizvana Bradley, Deanna Brand, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Malik Gaines, Sadia Hartman, Danielle Rose King, Jessica Lynn, Noma Duma Masalela, Catherine McKittrick, Uri McMillan, Sequoia Miller, Stephen Nelson, Tavia Nyong'o, Lorraine O'Grady, Rihanna Jade Parker, Yasmina Price, Ava Respini, Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, Christina Sharp, and Hortense Spillers.
So not all female.
No,
Right.
no, not.
Good.
But in a community, and I think
Yes.
a community of people who have sustained the conversations that Simone has talks about in her work, the questions she's asking in her art practice, and the people that she really considers who have influenced her practice, her 4 sisters, her 4 mothers, but also the people that she's brought up along with her. And I think that's what the range of these contributors and seeing everything in print has really opened for me. Is just thinking about how much work this will do for future generations, for future scholars and future artists. So that is something that is really exciting that I can't wait to have out in the world.
You and us both, yes. I think that's a really good segue to talking about Loophole of Retreat, Venice, because the contributors are certainly one kind of a community that made this happen. But Simone brought together with Rashida Bumbre as the organizer a much larger group of people in Venice for 3 days last October to exchange ideas, music, performance, thoughts about activism. Can you talk about, either of you jump in, about Loophole? It was extraordinary for all of us. We were all there.
Very extraordinary, and I actually, it's one of the first experiences that I had about the power of making art, but also the power of thinking about who you're making art for and who you're making art with. And I think that's a question that Simone has asked consistently in her practice. And one of the ways that's expressed is in her social practice, sometimes called social sculpture, but it's an aspect of her art making that she's began in around 2010, around that year, and has continued since into the present through the Loophole of Retreat conferences. And these works take different forms. They often are made in collaboration with her collaborators, her friends, people who have created ideas or conversations that have sustained the questions that she asks in her work, and is expressed in many different ways. It was actually one of the first experiences I had meeting Simone. I don't know if I ever told you the story, Jill. Ava knows the story. But one of the first times I really encountered Simone as an artist was in the Guggenheim Loophole of Retreat, which is the first iteration of this convening of Black women artists and thinkers and poets coming together for a one-day symposium to coincide with the Hugo Boss exhibition that Simone was awarded in 2019. And I was in graduate school at that time, and I remember I knew right away I had to go attend. So I remember getting on the 4 a.m. bus from Providence, going down to New York, and just camping outside the Guggenheim because I knew I needed to get a seat. And I knew even then that this was something that you can't miss. You had to see it in person. And it was an experience that I will never forget. I mean, it was so impactful to just be in that presence of such a supportive group of sisters and people who really celebrated each other, the intellectual labor they had, the ideas they had, the work that they were doing, and recognizing that this is work that shouldn't be done in isolation, that this should be done in community. So seeing that come to life again in Venice in the 3-day symposium was a really fantastic experience. It was an extension of the Loophole of Retreat conference in Guggenheim, and this time organized in Venice by Rashida Bumbre, a longtime collaborator of Simone's, and brought over 600 women, I think, Black women to Venice in over 3 days to think about art, to think about ideas, to think about histories, and again, to do this in community, not to do it in isolation.
And in person after the pandemic. Did you actually talk to her in New York at that loophole?
I did, yes. She thinks it's the funniest story.
loophole? Can you, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add there is to really stress that Loophole of Retreat is an artwork and considered an artwork that was presented as part of the U.S. Pavilion presentation. And so, and it's part of a longer tradition of, as Annie was saying, social practice, social sculpture is how Simone would call it, that she has been, working on for over a decade or 15 years that include projects like the Free People's Medical Clinic. And what I'll say is with these social practice works, you can't show them in the gallery. What are you going to show? Some photographs or, ephemera, they don't have that same impact. And so the book does a lot of heavy lifting, and Annie has a wonderful contribution in the book that really maps out the history of these kinds of projects that Simone has done with some really great archival photographs. So hopefully those folks who haven't had the privilege of being attendees at these events can get a sense of their importance through the scholarship in the book.
I mean, there is probably a Venn diagram that has Simone and her team and us at the center, but in one way, it would be a beautiful diagram of all the different communities that intersect with the center, because in many respects, 3 years has been a series of communities. And another of those communities has been the group of students with whom we worked at Spelman College. We spent maybe a year and a half, I'd say, with them. With Spelman, we organized a seminar for students across the college and actually some of their partner colleges that are all collaborators in Atlanta, to spend a year studying the art and ideas of Simone Leigh and all of the related topics of Black feminist thought, performance, history, African diasporic art and references and how they relate to the work. And then we brought the students to Boston, where they met with people from every different department of the museum, hoping we would be introducing the next generation of young people to this great world and work. We then brought them to Venice for Loophole, where they actually had the job of introducing all the different speakers throughout the 3 days. They have written about selected works in the exhibition, and all of that is available on our website and in our Mediatek, and we've stayed in touch. So it has been very, very fruitful. And last week at the opening, where we had some Spelman people in the house, we were talking about a possible project moving forward that would be really, really exciting. So it's a partnership we're hoping and to continue and deepen. You met with them, both of you met with them on Zoom.
Yeah.
What was that like?
I mean, it was fantastic. It was one of the, this was during that year-long seminar and the preparation and the run-up to Venice. And it was a chance to really, talk with these young students who had such great questions, who were just so invested, not just in the work of Simone and the questions she's asking in her work and the ideas that she's exploring, but also in curatorial practice, the questions of how to represent an artist like Simone on a national stage, on a global stage. It was just really refreshing to be reminded about the work that we do reaches a lot of people. It extends beyond the exhibition, extends beyond the catalog. It really extends and makes an impact in everyone's experiences. And it was just such a renewed sense of energy around these students.
Makes you very optimistic about the future when the news is, just a horrible fire hose of, tragedy. But in fact, they make you optimistic about the future, right?
Yeah, I remember when we were in Venice together with them and they saw, I was there to give them a tour of the pavilion, and when they saw it for the first time in the flesh,
Yep.
I mean, it was a very moving moment, and for me to take that in and to see them take it in, they know the work very well. They've written about the work, they've studied it, they met Simone, they've met all of us. So they had an intimate knowledge of the work, but you could see that it was transformative to experience it in person on that stage.
Before we move next, could you share some of the celebrities who went to the Venice Biennale, to our pavilion? Because that was very exciting.
Yeah, who were some of the celebrities? Hillary Clinton was top on my list.
Yeah. you know.
Ava DuVernay was
Ava
another
DuVernay,
one. who-
Sherilyn Eiffel,
Uh-huh.
Julianne Moore.
Julianne
Right,
Moore, who
who's-
came twice, apparently.
Right.
Yeah, and I think a few other people from the film festival. You know, Venice has a film
Right.
festival every year, so I think there were a couple more
Yeah, it was
movie-type people.
all of the people who worked at the Guggenheim, the Peggy Guggenheim collection. Oh, here's something which is about organizing the U.S. Pavilion. The U.S. Pavilion is actually owned by the Peggy Guggenheim collection and managed. And so they staff it. And so we got all this information from the people working at the pavilion. They'd be like, guess who's here? Here's a photo. I mean, we were so excited. All right, we have a bunch of, or at least a few images to give you a sense of some of the objects in the show, both older and newer, right? And let's see what we have and then we can come back, right? Beautiful installation, again, of a work that got kind of blown up in scale
Yep.
for this exhibition, as
Yep.
did the pool.
Yep.
But Ava, could you talk about the continuum of Simone's work? You alluded to it, but what for you are the consistent themes? We know the materials, but what are the themes that, you know, basically are, you know, really we see from the very beginning, even if the forms change or evolve?
Well, this is a good slide to articulate some of the themes. I mean, I think the notion of always forefronting Black women and their experiences and everything that she does in terms of the work and the making of the work, the primary audience of the work, but also notions around labor. I mean, there's so much in the work that's about labor, unacknowledged labor, invisible labor, the labor of women, the labor, intellectual labor of artists, domestic labor, which I think you can see a little bit in this slide. And also this notion of thinking about the body and architecture, and I think maybe in the slide before, it's a good example where, you know, this sort of dome-shaped, bell-shaped form that on one hand is a reference to garments like a skirt, which is, you know, has traditionally been associated with the female gender, but also its ability to also embody architecture and various kinds of architecture that Simone has referenced, like sub-Saharan Muslim architecture, among many others. And then the motif of the cowrie shell is something that has repeated again and again. But this notion that the body, the femme body very specifically, is in the way in which it's married with architecture, with vessels, such as jugs or pitchers, and all of those associations that come with that, right? If you think about the femme body in a vessel and those associations around, you know, women and nurture, women and sustenance, women in care, but also women in labor too. That I think is very evocative throughout the exhibition and many of the works. And just to bring it back to the very first question that you asked, Jill, that I think that's why Simone's insistence on not looking at a chronological approach makes sense with her work. Not every artist, I think, could benefit from that approach because she has a very consistent visual language that is so her own and so unique. You can do a show and you can make rooms that are across time and yet the works speak to each other. Not all artists produce that way. You know, some artists are much more, you know, various in their output, but I think in this case it really works.
Annie?
I mean, one of the things that I really learned from the experience of working with Simone on this installation is just thinking about work that is not finished, and I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about artwork. You know, we in art history and in the museum world, I think we receive the object as it is, and we present that in the story that it tells. And Simone thinks in a very different way. You know, she's thinking of work that that has a life, that continues to have a life, that has a continuum of its own. So I think that was a really interesting way of presenting the works in this exhibition, and I hope that comes through in people's experience with this work. They might see works that they've seen before in other contexts, But it's that renewal of context, that renewal of conversation that is constantly going, that Simone is constantly uncovering in her practice that is so important to the output that she produces in her work that I have found really significant.
And just to say, what you're looking at is the same artwork, the one with the raffia. We received it that way. It's in the show, and Simone, I think to our surprise, she said, let's take that raffia off. And we said, okay, well, it does belong to somebody. Let's get in touch with that lender. Simone was very persuasive and, communicated with the lender her reasons why. And the other thing is we also took it off its base, and Simone really wanted to see that piece grounded on the floor. So the image on my left is how it's presented upstairs. The other image is how it was presented at the Guggenheim. And it really does feel and look very different. Yes, it's the same form, but the resonance is different. And in that room, putting it on the floor, taking the raffia off, really made a lot of sense, from a visual perspective. But she wasn't, I think we were surprised, or I should speak for myself, I was surprised by how the works weren't precious. She was very much, really wanting to think about these works as living, breathing things that continue to change.
It's interesting because you've talked about her work as compressing time, but in many ways it's actually expanding time, right? In the sense of it both crosses time in combining references and images and, as we said, across space and geography, but across time as well. But this notion of constantly working and reworking these pieces does the opposite at the same time. So it's actually, in some ways, that may be the kind of double helix that we never really saw till Simone actually arrived on site to install. That was new, new for us to see.
There's a way that Simone talks about ceramics that I found really interesting, where she thinks of the kiln as a metaphor for identity formation. That what enters the kiln as a ceramic, a lot of times you don't know what will come out of it. It might be affected by the other elements that are in the kiln, the temperature that it's fired at. These are all kind of experimentations that you then receive and witness after it's emerges out of the kiln. So this idea that we're informed by our associations, by the people around us, by our environments, by the histories that we embody, and then the futures that we might possibly create. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about this idea of work on a continuum. That she is a maker first and foremost, that she's constantly making, and that idea of making is never ending, that things are always in progress, that our identities are always in progress, that the relationships we form are always in progress.
That's beautiful. She said during the installation that she saw what she wanted was to make an exhibition of beauty. So on top of all of these other things, she wanted it to be beautiful, which I hope you've seen or will see and agree that she was extremely successful in that. It is compelling, magnetic, powerful, and I'd say indelible in the impression it makes. Anyways, we want to leave everyone time to go upstairs, and we'll hang around. We're going to end on this. You've seen it because you must have walked through it, under it, or by it. This fantastic work, Satellite, which actually, as you saw, was also at the entrance on the exterior of the Pavilion in Venice, and which took a lot of work to get to Boston and site here. But we're so excited that we were able to do it. And we're so grateful that you chose to spend some of your evening with us. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.